We got like 90% of our participants, but these were more kind of seasoned psychonauts, and also the naturalistic environment that might have been contributory. But the majority of people, we found about 85% considered them to be real.
I just think it's all so interesting. But maybe where we'll start is your DMT field experiment. This is something that I think is really cool. Talk to me about what you did.
So we're interested in DMT phenomena, um, and the experience of that, but also kind of looking at some of the kind of coming towards that experimentally as well. And we didn't have a particularly big budget to do expensive lab work, administering DMT, which, needs substantial funding, all the facilities at our university. And also we wanted to kind of mine the kind of environmental potential of it as well in going around to people's houses whilst they were taking DMT and then getting them in their naturalistic environment. So it's kind of less oppressive in some ways than doing it in a laboratory. People perhaps feel more natural and relaxed in their home environment. So chose a naturalistic field study, which I think still gives as useful and relevant data as an experimental lab study, but maybe with a little less control, but a little more authenticity. And so that's what we set out to do.
But what was the research goal? What part of the DMT experience were you interested in?
So we wanted to look at a lot of different things, and we're still kind of writing up some of that research. It's like an ongoing endeavor. Um, so initially, also the phenomenology, the kind of lived experience, but under with a kind of a specific sample of people who are experienced psychonauts. There wasn't much good contained phenomenology of the DMT experience at that point. A lot of it was kind of being stripped from Erowid or Reddit or whatever, and people analyzing these kind of online databases, if you like. So we wanted to have a kind of contained and discrete sample of experienced psychonauts. And so we interviewed everyone immediately after their experience to kind of mine the phenomenology of it. And then we also had a bunch of psychometric measures to look at to see how they relate to the experience, and some outcome measures as well of people's descriptions of the altered state, the mystical experience, and so on. And then also some experimental elements too. So for about half the participants, we did a precognition experiment to see if they could kind of access information from the future under controlled conditions. And we had control condition, experimental condition, and also a shared visionary experience experiment as well. So people having DMT as a pair with the intention of having a shared experience, but without any prior conversation between those two people, and then being separated immediately afterwards and interviewed about their experience, and then using that to compare it to trips of people on their own under the same kind of circumstances. And then we had to go through this very lengthy procedure of getting independent judges to rate all those different trip reports and try and match them together to see if people under blind conditions could independently discern which trips were coincidental. So, which is quite, you probably haven't heard much about that, but still yet to publish that. But all of it really fascinating and illuminating, but always leading to more questions than answers, really.
So, how many people in this field study experience what people call a DMT entity?
I mean, increasingly, there's a handful of people doing it usually as a bit of a kind of sideshow. Um, I'd say one of the kind of main researchers in this area is my dear colleague Chris Timmerman. I was with at the weekend at Breaking Convention Conference, and he's probably done some of the most concerted work in this area by doing brain imaging, both fMRI and EEG, simultaneous to people's entity encounter experiences with DMT and even DMTX, like extended DMT experiences. And that's starting to produce some really interesting findings, which again lead to more questions than answers. Hopefully you'll get Chris on the show. You can ask him about that, but and not wanting to gazump his own findings. We did find like a shift in brain activity when people have DMT entity encounters. So normally in the DMT experience, it's high entropy, a lot of kind of internal chaos, if you like, in the brain. And then at those points when people are having a DMT entity, there's more coherence in the brain. So there's a shift in the brain activity during those entity encounters. Unfortunately, in that research, and I think this might be the next step, and we hope to pursue this, is that we don't know which came first. Is it like
Yes.
the have a moment of brain coherence, and therefore they see an entity in the chaos of the the mental landscape, or do they have an entity encounter and that leads to the brain to become more coherent? So it needs some more kind of fine grained timing, I think, to kind of like maybe unpack that a little bit more. But there's making some advances, and I think Chris is really pioneering a lot of the work in this direction.
For sure. I've been in contact with Chris a few times, so I really hope to have him on the podcast very soon. Because I've spoken to Andrew Gallimore and Anders Gomez Emelson, a lot of the leading DMT experts, and it just fascinates me completely and stumps my previously held materialist beliefs because it doesn't doesn't provide any explanation. When you talk to these people, when you do these phenomenological interviews post experience, post DMT trip, what kind of words do they use to describe these entity encounters? What modalities do they invoke? Like what kind of things, what kind of concepts do they talk about?
I mean, there's usually quite a few expletives, and it's quite superlative language. These are kind of quite intense experiences, even to seasoned psychonauts. It's like it's almost like the first time every time in a way. In that it's profound, but it's so most often we found, as a trend, for instance, and we got very high entity encounter reports in our study. Like Chris is talking, somewhere between about 40 and 60% in the studies he's done. We got like 90% of our participants, but these were more kind of seasoned psychonauts, and also the naturalistic environment that might have been contributory. But the majority of people, we found about 85% considered them to be real, right? So that they, uh, obviously this is when they come back. I think they all probably feel it's real at the time in the experience, but in the kind of evaluation afterwards. So like the people are treating them as a genuine other with some kind of sentience, and that's usually how it's experienced, and that's probably the most astonishing thing about it, really. Um, I'm going to sidestep here because there was some brilliant survey work came out of Johns Hopkins University with Roland Griffiths and his team before he passed, uh, and they did a survey of nearly a couple of thousand people had DMT entity encounters with high doses, and they looked at their prior spiritual orientation, and then afterwards, and of those people who were atheists before, less than half of them remained atheist afterwards. So that
Wow.
really gives you a bit of a sense of how intense these experiences can be if a 10-minute psychedelic trip can reorientate your whole spiritual framework from atheism to non-atheism. And therefore, I think it very much earns the adage. One of our participants said, like DMT is a little bit like being punched in the back of the head by God. And we now have some data to kind of underscore that particular phrase, I think.
Fascinating. One of the characteristics that's frequently brought up is the consistency of these trip reports. And like, why would there be consistency, right? If you're following Robin Carhart Harris's entropic brain hypothesis model, there's an extra noise being inserted into these, layer 5 pyramidal neurons. You're getting extra excitability, more disorder. Why would that cause consistency in the hallucinations? Why would that, if it's just sort of increasing noise, at least in my view, it doesn't seem like you would get this 85% of people report sort of a similar type thing. And then you have all these archetypal images that people seem to see, like the great serpent or the mother, or the mantis. Like, how do you explain this, or how do you think about this? Because in my mind, neurochemistry, pharmacology just kind of runs into a wall here in explaining why people would see this consistency in structure and form, and often these crystalline figures symmetrical, multifold structures seem common. Like that, it doesn't seem to me like neurochemistry and pharmacology explain that. But I'm curious, with all of your, work and experience, like how do you think about what's happening in these moments?
Well, yeah, I'll start off by saying there's probably like multiple etiologies and factors to consider, right? So some of it, you can never get away from cultural influences, for one thing. You can't have a culturally unmediated experience, or an unculturally mediated experience, if you like. So we are the kind of product of our environments, and everything we've ever seen and experienced could be kind of seeping in and priming the kind of experience we have. So it's a bit hard to get beyond that. And yet I don't think it still reliably accounts for some of the consistencies we see. So
Right.
myself and Andrew Gilmore tried exploring that particularly. And so we went back to the very first DMT trip reports from Stephen Zara in the 1950s. And sure enough, embedded in there in these obscure Hungarian psychiatric journals, there were accounts of people encountering little people, dwarves. And so like it's hard to imagine that that was the seed of these later, oh, you get elves, everybody does memes, right? And it seems that there's as good a kind of consideration that there is just something inherent about the experience which leads to the encounter of little people. But we can't ever get away from the cultural
Yes,
influences
I agree with that.
unless there was this kind of urban legend mythological experiment which never happened, which came out of Berkeley in the 1970s, that had given ayahuasca to Inuits, right? And supposedly they saw jaguars and snakes. Would have been a brilliant experiment pre-internet if that could have ever happened, but it didn't happen. It was just an urban myth. But that's the kind of thing you'd have had to do, and it's almost impossible now in the internet age to know that we are having experiences which aren't culturally mediated. So it's quite hard to establish that, first of all. And then you have, Robin's take on it is that, yeah, we're having this kind of like uh, highly kind of chaotic sensory experience or internal experience through stimulation of neurotransmitters. And that leads to kind of more kind of informational noise. And then in a kind of apophenic or pareidolic way, we then literally, in Robin's case, we quite literally see, patterns in the chaos, in the noise. Now that explanation goes some way, but it doesn't account necessarily for the consistency, or necessarily even that that actually happens. So, we found that even people with aphantasia have no visual mental imagery still get DMT entities. And so it's not being visually driven. It's not being driven by mental imagery, visual mental imagery, because they really genuinely don't have any, as far as we can tell. You can do kind of cognitive behavioral measures on them, and their pupils don't dilate in response to imagery of light like everyone else does. So that it seems like they genuinely have no visual mental imagery. So that it's not a kind of visual driver. If it's kind of like picking out patterns in the chaos, it must be happening on a conceptual level or somewhere else. But we need to kind of explore that further and unpack it. But again, why the consistency? Why jesters? Why octopoids? Why giant praying mantises doing operations on your brain, upgrading you,
Yeah.
and informing you for your emotions? Those ones are kind of really specific. Uh, uh, and so trying to tease apart how much of this is like dimethyltryptamines, and how much of it is like kind of core coming directly from the experience itself. Uh, that's hard to tease apart.
Ex- I share exactly what you just said. There's absolutely shared deep subconscious cultural priming, and I do think that can actually go quite a far way in explaining some of the strange phenomena that you see, like the DMT laser experiment. That's I sort of would believe that that is very front loaded with expectation and priming, and I think that that can provide quite a lot of explanation there. Um, but I just don't understand why. Yeah, this mantis operating you on a surgical table. I talked to someone yesterday who had that experience. Like that's like what I mean? Like that really challenges sort of everything I learned in college and kind of everything I've learned since college. Even, you know what I mean? And I'm like not really sure what to make of that. like, do you have any, like, I know more work needs to be done. Like, how do you think about that? Do you have any sort of framework, any sort of model for even remotely what might be an explanation, or like a direction of an explanation, or like a, you've thought about this and you've worked in these spaces longer than most. Like, you must have some sort of inkling on what the hell might be happening there. And you can
I
you can
mean,
speculate all you. We're on a podcast, man. You're not going to be held to it.
no, no worries. I mean, I'll take the Robert Anton Wilson oath here probably, and that is anybody who says they think they know what's going on is probably full of shit. And so, like, I mean, I really don't have a clue, but I do kind of look to the data and try and understand it. And that data comes to me initially from 25 years ago, and around about that time of witnessing people naively having encounters with praying mantis entities, on their first ayahuasca trip or their first DMT trip, and them not being in any way remotely consciously knowledgeable of that being some kind of thing, and it's just kind of observing these kinds of experiences. And then, you go, oh, you got the mantids. And they're like, what do you mean? It's like, you mean other people have these experiences? Like, well, I've heard a few stories, and they're like horrified. So we're actually just launched last week the first survey on mantid entity encounters, just to try and collect some more data on this to see if there are any commonalities. And this is an interesting one, I think, the mantid one, because it doesn't just happen with DMT, but it does happen a lot with DMT. I mean, we got about 14% of our DMT experience in our study had insectoid encounters, right? But this is also something you hear from people who've never taken psychedelics. And I've come across, just randomly people have chatted to, friends and things who've had experiences in childhood of having giant praying mantises, encounters, or praying mantises living in their heads, and telling them things, and these are just like, these are from the voices of children, not from like adults smashing loads of DMT, having watched too many YouTube videos, right? So I think there's some interesting phenomena to explore there, both, and we can then compare, well, how do DMT ones compare to non-DMT ones, and so on. So I always look to the data. I'm always a bit short on explanations because, you know, uh, yeah, beliefs are prisons, aren't they? Our convictions make us convicts. I try to be as agnostic as possible and look to the data.
I mean, you literally study anomalies, right? So like, you wouldn't have a job. Like, it's anomalous for a reason that we don't have an answer for these things. I'd love to,
Exactly. I'll explain
yeah,
my way out of the job if I'm not careful.
exactly. The the cultural, I'd love to see some cross cultural comparisons on, putting that cultural hypothesis to test. So like, I'm in Malaysia at the moment, and I'm walking around, and I've seen some crazy ass praying mantis here. Massive ones, like really crazy looking insects that are like bigger than anything I've ever, like, I grew up in Ireland. I'm from Dublin.
Like
So
7
like,
foot.
yeah, massive. Well, not quite 7 foot, but
Then it's okay. There was no
I was
DMT.
I was on the psychoactive substance of caffeine only, and that's not known to create 7 foot mantis. But so like, I could kind of get that people from Southeast Asia that have grown up with these crazy insects and stuff might experience that. But like, there aren't mantis to my knowledge, or maybe there's extremely few mantis in Ireland, or like Ireland and the UK. Like, I don't think there are mantis. So like, why
No, no.
would we have that cultural priming? Like, why, growing up in these countries, like, we're not watching enough mantis. Maybe you are, mantis documentaries and stuff to have that cultural priming. Um, like, what you know what I mean? Like, maybe from countries where they're really common, like that, that's somewhat of an explanation. But like, I'm curious, are mantis DMT experiences more common in Malaysia than they are in the West, where you don't have mantis? Do you know of any cross cultural comparisons like this?
I mean, this research hasn't been done, and then also it'd be somewhat confounded, is like, because I'm not sure, what the prevalence of DMT consumption is in Malaysia. Might not be as high.
Extremely limited by yeah.
Yeah, probably Americans and Europeans, but it is a super curious question. Yeah, I mean, I never saw mantids growing up in the UK, right? And certainly not in Ireland. Uh, and that's it's a really interesting question. I mean, there are some things about mantids in that, they do have this, they're kind of almost the most humanoid of insects, but there's still, that's, okay, so if you're going to think of an insect, and it's kind of a bit humanoid and you mash them together, it might come out looking like a praying mantis, right? Because they kind of stand up and they've got these arms. But in any case, but why insects in the first place? So there are, but I would love to see more of this cross-cultural kind of research, not least because, so like perhaps like our oldest living ancestors are the San Bushmen of the Kalahari, and for instance, they worship the praying mantis as a deity. These hadn't changed their way of life as hunter-gatherers for hundreds of thousands of years until recently, when they were kicked off their line for diamond mining, prospecting, and whatnot. But so they have a very, very ancient tradition, and they venerate the praying mantis. And like, so, maybe it's this kind of deep atavistic, archetypal kind of presence. Maybe it's a collective unconscious thing, so even as kind of, white Europeans without any mantis anywhere are tapping into this kind of perhaps ancient relationship with some kind of, atavistic morphic force or something. I don't know. I mean, I
Yeah.
literally don't know.
Yeah.
But we need to take every possible angle on this, and just try and make some sense out of it rather than just ignoring it. First of all, we just kind of just get them to tell us about their experience in as much detail as possible, and then we'd kind of go back and just dig into what they said, and just attempt to kind of clarify. Sometimes it's kind of clearly explicit, but if it wasn't explicit or they didn't say, would say, and whether any, and whether did you have any encounters, and if so, can you describe those? So kind of laddering the interview, but initially just try and get down a kind of clean kind of delivery of what happened from start to finish in as much detail as possible. And then we also had kind of surveys, psychometric measures and questions as well, so they'd complete. And then ultimately, we got the 90% just by, that's based on the transcripts of what they said. I think it even is like 95% if you include sense presence as well. So like for about 90%, they had what they felt was a clear encounter, usually visual, and then the others, like a few would be like, there was the kind of the sense of another being there, which wasn't us, hopefully. And whereas the guys with aphantasia, there were two, there was no visual component, but there was entities there. Like one of them was like this. He said he was on this kind of like train ride, and he was kind of zooping around the train, and there's all these little people, and they were like, "Yeah, man, we're going for a ride, woohoo!" Like this, and he was like, "Yeah, we're just there with the boys." He called them the boys, and it was like, "Yeah, they were just like little, like elves." It's like, "Oh my god, they were like elves. Of course they were elves." And it was like, and so like, how did you encounter these experiences? Did you see them? It's like, no, I didn't see anything, but I just kind of knew, I knew I was on this
Exactly.
train ride with these elves. I just, so like, I don't know how that even comes about, but there was a kind of apprehension of that experience, of that knowledge, in the absence of anything seen.
This is what I was curious. Can someone have a visual entity experience and a gustatory entity experience? Can you have a tactile entity experience? Like we're very vision dominated people, but there are people that in their imagery profile, like aphantasia, are not imagery dominated, and they might be emotionally dominated. Like, can you have a purely emotionally driven entity experience? And I have no idea what that sentence means, but maybe to somebody else they do. You know what I mean? Maybe to someone else they do, and that makes complete sense. And they don't understand what we mean by visual entity experience. So they're like, the emotion one is the only one where it could be like, you're the one that's hallucinating, and like my emotions were real. And like, who's to say one is more salient than another? It's just the different modalities that people recruit into these experiences. But like visual seems like the dominant one, right? But were there other modalities recruited into these experiences?
I think there was some element of synesthesia or other kind of multisensory accounts, but not predominantly. Like DMT is typically a very visual sensed experience. Often like even the body kind of disappears as well. There's it's like it's not even an embodied experience, but it kind of is and it isn't. Sometimes it's like the body's disappeared, but you may have a sense of like, I've got a body, but it's not my body or whatever it is. Sometimes people felt they were the entities as well. But you don't see a lot of that kind of different sensory modality. I mean, people to get high emotions, like kind of feelings of kind of deep, profound bliss and awe and love and that kind of thing. But it would be great to see more kind of in-depth
Right.
studies exploring these different sense modalities with other people, people with, non-neurotypical as well, people with synesthesia or the visually congenitally blind or whatever it might be, to probe this in a bit more detail because, yeah, it's super interesting question. But yeah, DMT, primarily a visual driver, I would say, visual mental imagery anyway.
When people said 85% said the entities were real, did you ask them what they meant by real? I think this is a really interesting question and avenue as well. Like, what exactly does real mean?
Yeah. What the hell does real mean? I mean, that's just shorthand for. I think we asked a bunch of different questions. Like, I'd have to look back at this. It's been a long time, and it needs exhuming. But things like, do you believe they were sentient, self-existing in that space? Did they continue to exist? Do you think they continue to exist even after the DMT has gone? Where do they exist? So we asked, we kind of landed a whole bunch of different questions about that, but I can't remember what the key phrase would have been, but like they have some independent sentient existence. That's the kind of like crux of it. When we say real, what the hell does real mean? I have no idea.
Yeah.
But are they independently sentient?
The Giant Shoulder mission is to explore radical ideas in biology, neuroscience, and consciousness, and elevate those stories to the highest possible level while keeping them accessible to everyone. If this interests you and you want to support independent science, then please consider subscribing to the Clips channel